Weird. Uh, the thing shut down. It's true I was trying to shut some things down to make my computer work a little better, and really overloaded because it's processing the running Zoom right here at the screen here. Anyways, let me continue and down. It's trying to get me to buy Microsoft Office, which I have it on the crash. I don't have it on this computer, but it would be free. So when we compare aerobic respiration with fermentation, both processes do have glycolysis. Should speed up the working of my computer because now the layer has finished processing. And that means we're going to have two meetings, two files for the lecture today, by the way. Stopped working and Zoom shut down. There's aerobic respiration has glycolysis, and so does fermentation. Fermentation does not have the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain. Aerobic respiration does. Essentially, in aerobic respiration, electrons flow from glucose to carbon dioxide and water. Glucose is energy rich, carbon dioxide and water are energy poor, and we get a high yield of ATP production in aerobic respiration. In fermentation, it's similar, meaning electrons do flow from glucose, but they are actually the electrons flow to pyruvate, which is then converted into the fermentation product. We'll talk about ethanol and lactic acid. In fermentation, the yield of ATP is much, much lower than aerobic respiration. Question about any of that? That's just an overview of aerobic respiration and fermentation. This is another overview of aerobic respiration, how it happens in a eukaryotic cell. In eukaryotes, aerobic respiration begins in the cytoplasm. Glucose is converted into pyruvate by glycolysis, and this happens in the cytoplasm. Let me see if I can blow this up a bit. In the color very well, but we can make the box the cell, be the cytoplasm. We'll talk about NADH in a little bit. And then pyruvate moves into the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells. And this is the mitochondria, and that's where the majority of the rest of aerobic respiration occurs. In fact, where the majority of aerobic respiration glycolysis. And then citric acid cycle running inside the matrix of the mitochondria. And then the electron transport chain, which has a couple of different names. Why is my mouse dead? There it is. Happens in and across the inner mitochondrial membrane of eukaryotic cells. Some ATP gets made in glycolysis. Some ATP gets made in the Krebs cycle, also called the citric acid cycle. But most of the ATP gets made in the electron transport chain. purpose of NADH and as well as FADH, they are carrying the electrons from glucose or a derivative of glucose transport chain. CO2 is given off and ATP. Question about any of this? On prokaryote, they do not have mitochondria. And so almost everything is happening in the cytoplasm, except for the electron transport is occurring in and across the cell membrane. So instead of the inner mitochondrial membrane, electron transport chain in prokaryotes is happening in and across the cell membrane. Any question about any of that? They'll have you, so I'll continue. Some noise there, and I just want to make sure that the stop again. First step of respiration, I should state that respiration, aerobic respiration, has 3 steps. There's glycolysis, the first step. There is the Krebs cycle, and with the Krebs cycle, we can also put in the preparatory step. We'll talk about the preparatory step in a little bit, but the preparatory step and the Krebs cycle are the second step of aerobic respiration. And then the third step is the electron transport chain. In the first step, glycolysis, it does have another name, which I don't use. You can read about it, the Embden-Meyerhof pathway, named after the scientist who discovered glycolysis. What happens is glucose becomes oxidized to pyruvic acid. Glycolysis does occur in most living cells. Glycolysis can occur in the presence or the absence of oxygen. Glycolysis does not require oxygen, but it can occur when oxygen is present, as well as when it's absent. It does produce some ATP and some NADH. And as I stated earlier, the NADH carries electron to the electron transport chain, the third step of aerobic respiration. Process. It up a little bit and try and get that out of the way. The preparatory step of glycolysis, I guess I shouldn't call that the preparatory step. What happens in the preparatory of glycolysis is ATP is utilized. 2-ATP is utilized by glycolysis, but 4-ATP comes out. Here, 2 come out and 2 come out. So we usually say, glycolysis generates a net gain of 2-ATP, meaning 4 comes out, but it takes 2 in to run glycolysis. So the net gain is we get 2-ATP out of glycolysis. And then glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, is converted into pyruvic acid, a 3-carbon molecule. There are 2 pyruvic acids made because, well, pyruvic acid has 3 carbons and glucose has 6. Any question about any of that? Don't want you to know each of the steps. I was required to learn that when I was an undergraduate. Only each intermediate name, but we needed to know which enzyme was doing each step. Didn't know actually any of that. Glucose starts the process. we generate a net gain of 2 ATP, and we end up with 2 pyruvic acids. So you need to know that. And you should know that 2 NADH are made by glycolysis. Question about any of that? We state that pyruvate and pyruvic acid are slightly different. Pyruvic acid has the hydrogen attached to it. Pyruvate does not. However, the body handles these 2 molecules the same. So we will use them as if they are the same. And chemists wouldn't like that, but we're not chemists. So we will treat both of these as the same. Any question about any of that? All right, you should know that respiration can be in 2 different forms. It can be aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Both forms of respiration are the oxidation of molecules, mainly glucose, and that releases the electrons from the glucose. And those electrons are carried to the electron transport chain by either NADH or FADH2. Aerobic respiration, the final electron acceptor is oxygen. In aerobic respiration, the final electron acceptor can be many different molecules depending on what form of anaerobic respiration we're discussing. So we're just going to say that the final electron acceptor is a molecule other than oxygen. Any question about any of that? ATP is generated. It's a net gain of 2 ATP out of I should point out, it does happen in aerobic respiration as well as in fermentation. Pyruvic acid cannot be used directly by the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvic acid has to be changed into acetyl coenzyme A. This coenzyme A binds to the pyruvic acid. CO2 is given off, meaning pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon molecule. Acetyl coenzyme A is a 2-carbon molecule. So the first carbon dioxide comes off of a molecule. And then NAD plus is converted to NADH by the preparatory step. Any question about any of that? Here's a question for you. How many times does the preparatory step run for each molecule of glucose? Going to take a guess? Twice, if that was your answer. I didn't quite hear that. Okay. Yes. That's because there's 2 pyruvic acids that come out of glycolysis. So the preparatory step will run twice for each molecule of glucose. And that means there will be generated 2 NADH per molecule of glucose. The next step of aerobic respiration is the Krebs cycle. It has a number of names. It can't be called tricarboxylic acid because there's a lot of tricarboxylic compounds in it. It's also called the citric acid cycle because the first intermediate in the Krebs cycle is citric acid. And then both of them are abbreviated TCA for tricarboxylic acid and the citric acid. I tend to call it Krebs cycle after Dr. Krebs, who discovered it. And the Krebs cycle is what your textbook generally refers to it as well. The Krebs cycle, let me see if I can blow this up. This is showing you the preparatory step here, converting pyruvic acid into acetyl coenzyme A. And then the acetyl coenzyme A joins the Krebs cycle. It joins with oxaloacetic acid. Oh, come on, mouse. Right here, forming with acetyl coenzyme A forms citric acid, meaning 4 carbons plus 2 is 6, and there's citric acid. Citric acid is converted to this molecule. I'm not going to even mention it. Converted to this molecule, and the way NADH is generated and CO2 is generated. This molecule is converted into that molecule. Once again, another NADH is generated and CO2 is generated. This molecule is converted into that molecule. Along the way, ATP is generated. And this molecule is converted into that molecule. Along the way, FADH2 is generated. This molecule is into that molecule. This molecule is converted into that molecule. And along the way, NADH is generated. And we end up with oxaloacetic acid, which is the molecule we started with. And that's why it's called a cycle, because we start here and then end up where we began. So the Krebs cycle will always run as long as glucose is in the body or acetyl coenzyme A is in the body. Question about any of that? Joins the class. It's pretty loud on my end. And you can see how slow this is. You do need to understand and memorize everything that's in the red blocks. So in the Krebs cycle, we generate ATP. We also generate 4 NADH. One of those 4 is generated not specifically in the Krebs cycle, but in the preparatory step right here. You can hear me. It's telling me that it failed to detect the speaker.
I can hear you still.
FADH2 is also generated. The FADH2 is generated right here. The 4 NADH, one right here, one right here, one right here, and one right there. And then 3 CO2 are generated from pyruvic acid. 1 in the preparatory step, right there. A little too small for me to see. 1 right here and 1 right there. But remember, the preparatory step and the Krebs cycle will run twice for each molecule of glucose. So all of the atoms of carbon of glucose are converted into CO2, meaning glucose has 6 carbons. And the preparatory step and the Krebs cycle will generate 3 CO2, but because they run twice per molecule of glucose, we've converted all of the carbons into CO2. Any question about that? Know that because the preparatory step and the Krebs cycle run 2 times per molecule of glucose, then 2 ATP are generated per molecule of glucose right here. And 8 molecules of NADH are made. and then 2 FADH2 molecules are made per molecule of glucose. Usually when I'm asking you a question, how many ATP are made, I will say per molecule of glucose in the Krebs cycle. But it does depend, we're talking about pyruvic acid or whether we're talking about glucose. Any question about that? The NADH and the FADH2 carry the electrons to the electron transport chain. Questions about any of this? Forward. Well, if I do it this way, it's going to be hard. This is once again showing you the overview of aerobic respiration. It doesn't say aerobic respiration, but we're talking about aerobic respiration here. And then fermentation. The next part after the Krebs cycle is the electron transport chain. It's called the electron transport chain because it is a bunch of proteins in a membrane, meaning a chain of proteins in a membrane, and that they're each in turn reduced and oxidized as electrons from glucose are passed down the chain. What happens is the energy is released as the electrons are transferred from one molecule to another. Energy is ultimately released from NADH and FADH2, or we can say aerobic respiration if you want. It's eventually used by chemiosmosis to produce ATP. And open that, and I can't select it. You're going to have to watch this video on your own because I don't have access to it with this computer.